Richard Randall, and welcome back to Your Real Estate Voice with Barb Schlinker. She's the host of the program, and this is the weekly radio show that informs and it educates you on how to buy or sell real estate with Barb Schlinker, the owner broker of Your Home Sold Guaranteed Realty. Now, Barb, we air Your Real Estate Voice every Saturday, and if folks can't listen to the entire show, it is always available on Barb's site, barbhasthebuyers.com, or go ahead and search for Barb. You'll find her on most of the popular podcast platforms like iHeartRadio. Barb, a real estate sale is a business and a legal transaction that must be in writing. I know that contracts can be a little bit intimidating for some folks, so help us with this. Can a home seller change their mind after accepting an offer here in Colorado?
Well, Richard, as you can imagine, just like it's a very tenant-friendly state, it's also a very buyer-friendly state as well. So in this state, all licensed agents have to use the state forms that were provided to us by real estate attorneys. And I think the idea is to make the actual contract to buy a house, quote, understandable. But I find that a lot of agents either don't pay attention or they lack understanding of the contract. And that's a problem. I think when you're signing a contract, you need to understand what you're signing. Right now, it's over 20 pages long to sign a contract to purchase a home. The state doesn't require us to explain it to our customers. Now, I do anyway, because it's one of the most important purchases of their lives. So I think it's very important to explain it and make the buyers feel comfortable as well as the sellers in what they're signing. But the way the state has been set up the contracts, it's a very, very buyer-friendly type of contract. They have 8 different ways to back out of the contract and get their deposit back. In fact, they can go, if they're not protected properly, the buyers can go all the way to the finish line and walk away at the closing table and get their earnest deposit back. That's how bad it is in the state of Colorado. It's not the same everywhere else, but in general, what makes this difficult for home sellers during the process, and I've had many of them tell me they hate the process, is that here they are, they've accepted a contract, they're happy, they know they're going to their next move, they're planning their move, they're breaking down their house to get ready for their move. All the while, the buyer is doing what they call due diligence. So the buyer can bail out if they don't like their loan, if they don't get approved for their loan, if they don't like the title work, if they're not happy with the survey, if it's required, if they don't like the HOA. If they don't like the inspection, if it doesn't pass appraisal, and they just don't change their mind. They have all these different ways to bail out, where the seller is packing, getting ready, thinking they're going, and then, they may or may not make it to the finish line. And that's very nerve-wracking for most home sellers. And the other thing that a lot of sellers will ask me is, okay, if I accept a contract with this buyer who seems potentially financially shaky, right? Can I accept other offers? Well, you can accept a backup offer, but once you accept an offer from the primary buyer, they are in what they call first position. In other words, that contract either has to fail before you can pivot to another buyer, or you can put them in a backup position, like if it's a contingent contract. I'll tell a story about this because the word contingency used to always confuse me before I really understood contracts. But basically, it was probably back in the late 90s, the state put in the contracts this provision called inspection resolution. So the buyers, as part of their due diligence, they have a right to do an inspection. It does say in the contract, the home is sold as is, where is, with all its faults. Okay, but the buyer could inspect anything they want and they can bail out for any reason they want. But if they put in writing, they'll say, all right, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we want to buy the house, but here is my list of things that need to be fixed for us to move forward. Okay. then the response from the seller is called inspection resolution, which is, okay, Mr. Buyer, I'll fix this and this, but not that. Or maybe I'll fix all of it. Once the buyer and seller reach agreement, they both sign that resolution, great. The contract's moving forward. And then we're finalizing the appraisal and the loan, and we're getting to the finish line. However, if the buyer and seller don't reach agreement on that document on that day, the contract automatically terminates and the buyer gets their earnest money, and it opens the door for another buyer to get the house. So the first time I learned about this, thank God it wasn't through one of my clients, was for some reason this guy got a hold of my number when I was, kind of early in the real estate, kind of young in the real estate business. And he called me and he was very frustrated. He was trying to buy a home on the northwest part of town. He'd written an inspection objection with 15 different repair requests. In the meantime, the seller had a backup offer. Now, there's no requirement for the seller to tell the buyer they had a backup offer. There's also no requirement for the seller to answer the objection. They could just ignore the objection. But if that deadline of resolution comes and goes and the buyer does not withdraw their objection, that contract terminates and it opens the door for that backup buyer to get the house, which is exactly what happened to that one person who wasn't my customer. He was just so frustrated because he was living an extended stay. He thought he was going to buy a house. His agent did not tell him that if he didn't withdraw his objection by that deadline, it would open the door for somebody else to get the house. And that's what happened to him. And he had to go shopping for a different home. So he was pretty frustrated. So that's why it's a very critical deadline that we have to track. And the thing that amazes me is that these days, a lot of the agents will abdicate those kind of tracking responsibilities to an unlicensed, quote, transaction coordinator. So in the state of Colorado, there's no license for a transaction coordinator. There's no job description. There's no responsibility or authority of that person. But the agents are like, I'm a salesperson. My job is to go get contracts. I'm going to just move on and go try to grab this other buyer, get them under contract, and forget about all these deadlines. And they literally abdicate it to this unlicensed, unqualified person. And I've seen these agents blow major deadlines like that because they just let it go. They paid somebody $300 to track their deadlines and they didn't do it. So it doesn't make sense to me what goes on. It's very important that you pay attention because for the buyers and sellers, this is the most important thing to them, right? And how would you feel if you were doing your most important thing and all of a sudden a person you thought was working for you just abdicated the whole work to someone else? So it just, I don't know, it's crazy. It's crazy. You got to pay attention in this world. So once the buyer and seller have gotten past the inspection, then it's appraisal. So there's one out for the seller for inspection, only if the buyer fails to withdraw their objection. That opens the door to get another buyer, okay? But let's say we get past that, then the appraisal comes along. An appraisal is an opinion of value done by a licensed person that confirms that the home is worth the agreed upon sales price at or above, and that the home meets the loan guidelines. So that's another tricky part in our contract, especially for a lot of people in this market are getting FHA and VA loans. So the appraisal house lender property requirements are a little bit stricter than for conventional, meaning things like peeling paint on the outside would get tagged by an appraiser. I just had one a few weeks ago where the fence was leaning over a little bit in one section. So a lot of buyers agents assume that, hey, the appraiser said this has to be fixed for the buyer to get their loan. So they punted that task to me. And I said, hold on, you already got your concession for inspection stuff. You didn't ask for that. And now you're saying because the appraiser wants it, you want the seller to do it. I'm like, no. It's the buyer's loan. The buyer can do it. So to satisfy the appraiser, the buyer had to go resupport the fence to meet the loan guidelines. It doesn't say in the contract who fixes it, it says it has to be done, or if they have to just notify the seller if that's a problem. So in general, inspections can cause pretty much any reason for it to fall apart. Appraisals, occasionally, it doesn't happen as often. And then, of course, loan approval. And occasionally, some buyers just change their mind. What's interesting is like places like Texas, the buyer has 10 days to do their due diligence. And after that point, their earnest deposit's non-refundable. That's not the case in the state of Colorado. We protect our sellers, but I will tell you that if the buyer changes their mind at the closing table, at the finish line, if that seller is not protected, the buyer could walk away and get their earnest money back, but we protect them. So if you are thinking of making a move, give us a call, 719-301-3900. My name is Barb Schlinker, the broker owner of Your Home Sold Guaranteed Realty. And we're talking about the contract process and whether or not a home seller can walk. So when we come back, we're just going to touch on some protections that you should have in place when you go under contract. Richard?
Now, Barb, we're discussing the real estate contracts, the provisions, and what can be inserted or not into those contracts to protect both the buyers and the sellers. We know that buyers have plenty of ways to get out of a contract, but what are some contract provisions that actually help the home sellers?
Well, if a buyer comes to you and says, hey, Mr. Seller, will you reserve this house for me and wait for me to sell my home that's not on the market yet? As a home seller, Richard, how would you feel about that?
I would not feel very good about that at all.
No, there's no certainty in that deal. Yet I get offers like that all the time. And so if a buyer has a house to sell, they have a problem. They want to pull their equity out of their home to buy their next home. Maybe their current home needs to be paid off before they can buy their next home. And of course, they don't want to move twice. I understand that. We actually have solutions for those buyers. We can typically get a half dozen cash offers for just about any address in the country and solve that problem for them. Plus, if you're worried about something like an appraisal, we have lenders that will do an appraisal guarantee. So if you're a buyer, it's just like buying with cash. So if you are thinking of making a move and you want to have some protections in place when you're selling a home, we know how to do that. Give us a call, 719-301-3900, or go to barbhasthebuyers.com. I have over 28,280 buyers just on my little website. Typically, I can match over 1,000 of them to your home, and we can market directly to those buyers so you can maximize your sales price. Call us at 719-301-3900 or go to barbhasthebuyers.com. Richard?
You're listening to Your Real Estate Voice with Barb Schlinker of Your Home Sold Guaranteed Realty. And remember, if you're thinking of making a move, call Barb at 719-301-3900, or as always, visit barbhasthebuyers.com. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll be discussing how to sell your Colorado home for the most money. Stay tuned for that.